The next move is to de-escalate one way or another. You can keep moving these tariffs up higher and higher and higher, but they don't, from an economic standpoint, that doesn't matter anymore. There are very few goods that are going to be economically competitive at, say, 50%, but not at 100%, or at 100%, but 50% to 100%, 80% to 120%. We're at 145% for some goods right now. We stopped being economically competitive in this trade a long time ago. So it's not about how much higher tariffs can get. It's not even where they are now versus yesterday. It's about whether this is going to be sort of a short-term disruption and someone's going to step in and say we need an off-ramp, or whether this is the beginning of a broader decoupling.
Leland, this is why we wanted to touch base with you again, because I think we need to understand the U.S.-China relationship. We've talked for a long time how they need each other, but at the same time, we've talked about decoupling over a few years now. So explain the U.S.-China relationship, why it's still either crucial, intertwined, and hard to untangle.
Well, these are the two biggest economies in the world. You've got the biggest consumer market in the world. You got the biggest producer in the world. There's a lot of interwoven supply chains throughout. So there has been decades worth of trade that has been built on the idea of the U.S. and China being principal parts of those supply chains together. So there's a lot to potentially disrupt. Now, when people talk about decoupling, they mean all kinds of different things. If you're talking about broad decoupling, financial decoupling and all kinds of other things, it could be a very big deal. If you're talking about sector by sector decoupling, we've already been seeing that. So in the tech sector, we've already been seeing a move away from allowing Chinese technology in the U.S. and U.S. systems, the U.S. technology, some Chinese systems, been pushing back on that with lots of export controls and other things. So you can see some aspects of decoupling, but a broad decoupling where you just sort of cut the knife down the middle of the cake, that's a much bigger deal economically and otherwise.
Can that even happen?
Well, it's hard to imagine that happening outside of sort of wartime scenario because of the disruptions would be so significant on both sides. Now, if you keep tariffs at 125% plus going forward, then you're going to have a decoupling. So what would happen then is you'd have a lot of dislocations from this. It's possible for the U.S. to move away from China as a supplier, and it's possible for China to move away from the U.S. as a supplier, and to sort of move those relationships apart from where they've been traditionally. Very hard to do that overnight without severe problems in supply chains and price hikes and other things. You don't have immediate substitutability for a lot of these things. The quicker you do a decoupling, if you're going to do a decoupling, the more disruptions you're going to see, and the more intense market reaction you're going to see.
When do you think consumers are going to start to see disruptions caused by this? Carol and I were just talking about the way that certain companies are adding a Trump Liberation Day or a Liberation Day tax to a surcharge, I guess you could say, to certain products. When do you think consumers are going to start seeing this?
Well, they'd start seeing it pretty quickly, I think, but it's very different. A lot of what people don't see is that China's a major provider of intermediate goods, and so a lot of the parts that go into things that are sold by other people, including the United States, come from China. So if you start taking those out of the equation because they're priced out of the U.S. market, or in some cases prohibited altogether, then you start seeing supply disruptions. Then you start seeing significant price pressures, particularly in very specific sectors, and you have a lot to worry about. So I think a lot of this is about, what is the timeline for doing this? Have we just snapped our fingers and moved to 125% tariffs going forward, which again, I don't think is going to be the case. But if we do that, then you have to be prepared for disruptions. You have to be prepared for price hikes in specific sectors.
What ways can China get around this? And I think specifically about transfer shipping, the idea of shipping goods that are actually made in China to a different country before then they make their way to the U.S. Do you have any numbers behind that? What do we need to know?
Transshipment, nobody knew what that was a few years ago. Now, I spent all day today in meetings discussing transshipment. It's extremely important. The idea being, of course, that, if the U.S. is trying to tariff China and say, we're going to tariff you at 100%, if China can simply take the item and send it to Vietnam or Malaysia or somewhere else in Southeast Asia, Mexico, and relabel it as a new product and send it through, then it could avoid tariffs. And what you do there is you avoid what the intended policies by allowing a third party to be the shipper into the United States. That used to be widely ignored. Now I think there's a wide appreciation in D.C. that something needs to be done about transshipment, because whatever U.S.-China policy settles at, you don't want it to be easily avoided through shipping products through third parties. That's why there's going to be a lot of push from some of these traditional transshipping countries. There's going to be a lot of push to get their house in order, to get more transparency, and to avoid this, or they're going to be punished themselves.